switch gallery view, and here we go. So I've got a special treat for you today. Last week, you got me ranting at my laptop alone in my office for 105 minutes. And that was more than a little bit you. So I'm delighted to be interviewing one of the authors of one of the readings that we assigned for the week, namely Scott Robbins. Scott is a former colleague of mine from the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands, and he's currently a research fellow at the Center for Advanced Security, Strategic, and Integration Studies at the University of Bonn. As you'll probably have seen from reading this, artificial intelligence. Scott, thank you for your time and welcome.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Cool. Let's just jump straight in. So I asked my students to read your paper on envelopment. Do you say envelopment or envelopment?
I say envelopment, but I've never heard anybody but myself say it out loud. So you should ask Floridi how he says it.
Okay, fair enough. Paper on envelopment for this week. And this is an interesting paper in a lot of ways, one of which is that last week we read one of Andy Clark's chapters in which he argues that one of the things that we should expect in the future is that there will be sort of more and more sort of cyborg-like integration between humans and technology, including AIs, with things like, prostheses, heads-up displays, sort of integrating AI directly into our brains or our sense organs. And it seems to me that what you're arguing for in this paper is directly at odds with that, because Clark is sort of advocating, or at least expecting, that in the not too distant future, humans will be integrated with machines and software in such a way that the sort of inputs that we can get from these things are unlimited, and the functions that they can perform are unlimited, and the sort of outputs that they can provide might also be unlimited, or at least not something that we know the limits of. So I'd like to ask you about this. Clark seems to think it's inevitable, and that in a way it's just part of cumulative culture, the increasing integration of tools into human life. But you argue not only that it's not inevitable, but that we have very good reasons not to let it happen. So can I ask you to sort of summarize why you think that, and whether you think it can actually be stopped?
Absolutely. I think Clark's position is interesting, and it seems to flow, be quite pervasive. There's no stopping technology. We should all just ride the wave and hope for the best. However, I think much work in the philosophy of technology, and I don't know if you've covered this yet, is about how as technological determinism is not necessarily a true thesis. We have the power to direct technology. We have to make the technology. And as individuals, we have to choose the technology we integrate into our lives. Governments have to choose the technologies that they're going to use to help them govern societies. And so my paper is kind of starting from this premise that it is a series of choices based on the technologies that we actually have, and how are we going to integrate that, and how should we direct the future development of technology as well. I mean, we have to fund this technology. We have to decide what to develop. And so when Andy Clark, I have a couple of problems with his thesis. I think inevitability is people could say it's inevitable in the opposite direction, and why would we say one or the other? It basically takes away the choice from us as human beings, which I think, why would we do that? We should direct how this technology is integrated into our lives. And also he's talking about technology that is still in a dreamland. We don't have anything like that technology. As much as Elon Musk wants to say that we have neural implants that can do all these things, the fact of the matter is we have little evidence that any of this stuff works. And the technology that we see successful right now are incredibly limited in what they can do. I mean, if you look at all the headlines for successful implementations of AI, you have incredibly narrow problems, and a lot of them are playing games. So incredibly narrow versions of what a solution is, winning a game. So this idea of unlimited possibilities and ability to do anything, this general all-purpose technology, is still a fantasy. It's still science fiction.
I tend to agree, but I wonder about this idea that we get a choice, because I mean, just look at the fact that you and I are currently talking to each other via Zoom, both of which we have privacy concerns about, and yet this is the only way I can teach my class. So it's not something, it seems to me, that is down to individuals, and I would be reluctant to blame individuals for using various kinds of technologies when they find them either inevitable or required by their employers or required by the state, or just easier than alternatives that might be on the market. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I've been concerned with my entire life, actually. I still don't have a smartphone, for example, because I find that when I did the calculation of whether that its inputs and outputs and concerns and the benefit and convenience that it offered me, on balance, it didn't help me as live the life that I want to live. And so I choose not to have it. Now, I also acknowledge that's an incredibly difficult choice, and it doesn't feel like much of a choice for many people. And many people, it absolutely is not a choice. And that is also the result of many decisions taken by universities, by governments, and others to, for instance, not regulate big technology companies, and to use technology for the sake of technology rather than to solve specific problems. It's kind of, I'm framing this paper in such a way that I'm saying that, well, we're going to act in this way, that we're going to ask, well, what is this technology good for, and how, is it useful in our lives, rather than, this is cool technology, how can we use it in our lives? I always ask the question first, why would we use this? What should we be doing? And of course, that's not how things are right now, but just because the way that the society is going right now is on this technological, explosion, and we should just use every new gadget there is, that doesn't mean it's going to be like that in 15 years. And it's partly on, on this generation, on the generation that, we're talking to right now, and our generation as well, to start actually asking these questions. Is using Facebook and Twitter actually doing anything useful for yourself, for others, and for society? And the people like me and you, we also need to decide this question as well, because we're setting an example. And yeah, I just don't think it's inevitable that everything goes the same way it's always been. I think that's, I'm hoping, maybe I'm a little naive there.
Fair enough. I hope you're right. Well, so the context for your paper is this movement towards, or in favor of, so-called explainable AI, and that idea comes from people who are worried about the fact that things like deep neural networks are able to do kind of astonishing things in some cases, really remarkable and impressive things, like crushing every human expert at chess and now even at Go. You can go to Google Translate and enter a sentence in one language, get it back in another in a course of, I don't know, something like 100 milliseconds. Whereas it used to take, finding a professional translator who was expert in both languages, and maybe that person didn't have time for you and you couldn't afford to pay them. So it does seem like there are uses for these things, which are possibly even inspiring, or at least incredibly valuable. You mentioned the case of the algorithm for classifying pictures of skin lesions as cancerous or not cancerous, that came out of that Stanford paper a few years ago. That seems incredibly valuable. And so it does seem like we don't want to take approach of saying just like, let Elon Musk do what he figure out, okay, these ones are acceptable, those ones are not, and here are the reasons why, would seem to be a good approach. And in the paper, you argue that specifically before an AI is implemented, either as software or in an embodied robot, we need to know what its inputs are, what its outputs are, what its functions are, what its boundaries are, and what kind of data it was trained on, assuming it was trained as in this sort of machine learning kind of training. Can you tell me a little bit why you think these are all and only the things that we need to know?
Right. So I want to hedge my bets here and say that that may not be all we need to know. I mean, it may not be exhaustive. I started from this idea that, you know, everybody was focused on explainability as the thing we needed to know, where I kind of bristled against that. Although I'm a skeptic of technology, I recognize the power of machine learning. And I thought, well, its entire power derives from the fact that we can't explain their decisions, right? It's not restricted, as I've said in a future paper, it's not restricted to human articulable reasons. It can have its own, a massive amount of reasons that we could never understand. And that's why it can do some of the things that we can't do. So we should ignore the idea that we should explain every machine learning decision, or that's the only thing we need to open up. I thought, well, then what is the problem? If I'm saying that explainability shouldn't be what we should focus on, then what should we focus on? And I think that there's a lot of other things that we don't know about a lot of these algorithms. We don't understand how they were trained, or if they were trained. Most people don't even understand that process and how that can map on to risks in the future. If you use a machine learning algorithm that was trained on data from 10 years ago, well, it may not be very reliable in a pandemic because we're all acting differently. And so we should know that. Governments should understand that. People who use that should know the limitations of training on older data. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Old chess games are helpful for new chess games always, but human behavior may drastically change tomorrow because of a pandemic. And then, well, those old algorithms don't help us the way that they should have. And then I think the boundaries and inputs, what I was really trying to get at is that, you know, with all these sensors, I mean, I think of an Amazon Alexa or really an autonomous car. These sensors, I mean, we don't understand everything, the possibilities of what they can see. And if we don't know what possible inputs there can even be, we didn't know they took sound into account. Well, that might change how we use it because it can take sound. I don't think they take sound, maybe they do, but I really don't, I don't understand that. I think we need to understand what kinds of inputs they can take. Because if they're only operating on camera, for instance, we may say, well, driving in the fog may not be a good idea, especially if you don't have LiDAR sensors on Tesla, for example. So that it really helps to have that information. And of course, not every user has to have that information, but somebody, a regulator, needs to have that information, for instance, in order to properly regulate them. And then boundaries, I was really getting at the idea that I want to know, like, where can they grab these inputs from? I'm a little bit concerned with, if I keep it on autonomous cars, you know, if they're able to operate on any road in the world in autonomous mode, well, then we have a possibly limitless number. I don't know how much driving you've done in other countries, but I think you've done quite a bit. And well, the roads and behaviors of people and just the obstacles that you encounter are very different from road to road, from city to city, from state to state, from country to country. And so we need to understand what was envisioned for the boundaries of where this car can go. And, you know, if it was only operating on specific highways that were determined to be autonomous car ready, well, the boundaries are really simple. We know now, okay, these are the places that it should go. And finally, the functions and inputs. We want to know what, like, the purpose of this machine is. So I make fun of Amazon Alexa in my paper a lot because I don't understand the purpose of the machine. I really don't get it. And maybe I'm just older now, but what is the purpose? Like, what do people use it for? Like, what's its overall function? And if it has multiple functions, that's okay. But I found it very, very scary, very Black Mirror-ish that this couple didn't even understand that one of the functions was to record audio and send it to colleagues. They didn't even understand that was possible, much less that it could happen without their consent or knowledge. And so I just thought that there was many other areas that it was easier to get this knowledge, like Tesla or these companies developing this AI should be able to provide this knowledge. And this is a simple way for us to make better decisions about where we use AI, rather than trying to solve this really difficult problem of explainability, which may then take away the very power that we were harnessing with machine learning. So I just thought, well, let's put everybody's focus in another area. Now, I'll admit it's a little more boring. I mean, for computer scientists, they want to solve really hard problems like explainability, and they definitely don't want to document their work. I was a former computer scientist. I hate documentation, and I understand why they don't want to do all of this. They have their narrow little idea about what it could do and how cool it is, rather than the difficulty of saying, like, what are the actual boundaries? What are the possible inputs here? What are the possible outputs? And what do I really want to advertise this machine being capable of doing? That may not be as much fun, but it is exceptionally important for governments and people to integrate this technology and to make choices about it.
Yeah, yeah, I think that there's a number of things to be said about that. So one is, I agree with you that the Amazon Echo, is it Echo or Alexa? I forget which company makes which one.
Well, I think Amazon Alexa is the name of the assistant, and the Echo is the product.
Oh, okay.
So the product that has Alexa on it, yeah. It's very confusing.
Yeah, so just by way of sort of anecdote, a friend of mine used to work for the FBI in counterterrorism, and you will not be able to find a picture of her on the internet. She doesn't have a social media profile. She doesn't get photographed when she appears in court. She goes out of her way to preserve her privacy. She also has an Amazon Echo in her house. And when I saw this, and I saw her accidentally order a product using it at one point, I was just thinking, like, wait a second, surely this should not be allowed, at least if you're like someone that terrorists might want to retaliate against. And it seems to me like this is, so you've got a bunch of examples in the paper, but this seems to me like an example where, like, it ought to be clear to people that this thing has all kinds of capabilities, and it can misfire in various ways, and that can be really dangerous. It's not just like you might download a song for 99 cents that you regret downloading by accident. Like, you could reveal your identity to someone who wants to kill you.
Yeah, I mean, your children can take, recordings of themselves and send it off to people or publicly post it, and that seems like a function you wouldn't want in your house. I mean, we've had numerous instances of smart cameras now being hacked by hackers. We just had a major hack of actually Tesla cameras and it was some camera security company that supplies cameras to all these other companies. And it was just hundreds of thousands of them hacked. And this is when I think in the paper I talk about Amazon Alexa and the idea, your friend accidentally ordered a product. And in the paper I talk about accidentally sending a recorded private conversation to colleagues. And I actually print out the explanation by Amazon. I actually word for word say what that explanation was. And it was basically this generic explanation about how, well, Amazon Alexa must have interpreted a series of sounds to exercise all these commands. Well, it's like, it didn't say exactly what sounds it did. So now all the users of Amazon Alexa have exactly zero information they can use to change the way they use Amazon Alexa to prevent this from happening to them. And I think that's a really strange situation where you have a horrifying situation that happened with a product that millions of people own with no information about how to prevent that horrifying situation. I mean, it seems a very novel situation where having people buy a device like that and integrate it into their lives, knowing these dangers and not being at all able to prevent them. I mean, I find this to be a very new situation. I don't understand why we give all of this technology a pass. And maybe it's just convenience, like maybe it's not hypocrisy. It's really just it's convenient to do this, and we just opt for convenience by default. That's my best guess.
I think that's part of it, but I think it's also just, you can't expect everyone to be a computer scientist or an engineer themselves. So, we saw this in the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C. All these people who stormed the Capitol and broke a bunch of laws kept their cell phones on. And then the FBI just used the GPS data to figure out who was there and
Right.
track them down. And it's just like,
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm not sympathizing with the insurrectionists, but
No.
I'm pretty sure that if they understood in advance what could happen, they would have behaved differently. And
Yeah, and actually, that's a really
ordinary
good
people
point.
can be in the same kind of situation.
Really, I mean, when it comes down to it, I think I'm on the side of, when I'm talking about Amazon Alexa and Tesla and using them as punching bags in my paper, I'm less frustrated with the people that integrate these technologies into their lives than with the governments that are allowing such technologies. Like, if you have a product that is recording conversations and sending them, and there's no explanation for how that happened, it seems, well, that doesn't seem like your product works very well. Maybe you should get a hold of that before you're allowed to bring it to market. I mean, it seems like you should have these basic things. And if we can't explain why your car in autopilot, I just saw this morning, there was a car that, a Tesla that drove underneath a semi. It looked like a similar problem. It was a white semi again. So maybe it was because the cameras couldn't see it. If that's possible, maybe we shouldn't have them out there yet. And most companies have made that decision themselves. They've self-regulated, right? They've said, I don't think our cars are ready. I mean, autonomous mode just isn't viable in most environments yet. And it seems strange to me that governments have just allowed this. And it also, I think in the paper, I also mentioned that it affects the rest of us, that these cars, even if I choose, I'm knowledgeable, I choose not to have an Amazon Alexa, and I choose not to have a smartphone, I choose not to have an autonomous car. Well, guess what? I'm I'm riding my bike, and my kid's on the back. I come across a Tesla. How do I act in front of that Tesla? Like, is the Tesla in autonomous mode? Like, this is another example of just basic information that could help me navigate the world. If I had just understood when Tesla was in that autonomous mode, well, I might steer clear of the Tesla because, I can't make eye contact with the driver to make sure they're not going to run into me, that they see me. I don't know who the driver is. It's the car itself. And I don't even know when it's the case that it's an autonomous mode or not. Well, that's an easy fix. There should just be a light. We have taxis that have whether they're taken or not. We could easily have autonomous cars say, whoa, I'm in autonomous mode right now. And we just haven't done it because because it's just a free for all. We're just like, well, technology is really cool. We can't stop anybody. We can't have any rules. No, we should have lots of rules about this in the beginning, at least.
Yeah, so that sort of leads to the second thing that I wanted to say, which is, so one thing you could do is say okay, anyone who wants to ride a bike has to wear a special helmet with QR codes on it. And then the autonomous vehicles will recognize those and be like, oh, that's a human being, don't run it over. And you could live in a society that's organized in that way. And that would be a kind of envelopment, but it would seem to be a kind of objectionable envelopment. I'd be kind of resentful if I had to put on this stupid hat every time I wanted to ride my bike. Last week we talked a bunch about niche construction and the idea that human children get something like 12 years of living in a very an environment that's highly designed for them, where they've got lots of chances to play, they have chances to use models of things that they might use later in their lives, they have raw materials, they get to make multiple failed attempts at doing things that if you were to try to do them as your job, you would just get fired for failing to do. And that kind of human niche is really valuable because it enables what Kim Sterelny calls the kind of apprenticeship, where people learn by doing, and it's okay that they fail most of the time, and they get lots of feedback, and so on and so forth. And you might think that envelopment is a kind of niche construction, but not for human children, instead for artifacts, like for AIs. And then the question is whether we want to afford them the same amount of potential for errors that we afford to human children. So when your kid, breaks a plate, or when your kid is trying to draw something and does it wrong and you have to throw away the paper, you're like, okay, I lost that paper. It wasn't so expensive. I love my child and it's totally worth it. But with AIs, as far as I'm concerned, like these robots don't have any intrinsic moral worth. They're tools. And to go out of our way to envelop them or to create a niche for them of the same sort that we're willing to create for young humans, for our children, seems to me to be like kind of misguided. And so I'm curious what you think about like the limits on how much we should allow envelopes to impose or impinge on our way of life.
Right. I think this is a really important point. I probably don't go enough into it in the paper, but I do mention the idea, and Floridi talks about this, that he believes that autonomous cars will be successful once we've created an environment in which they can be successful. So once we've censored the roads, rather than relying on all these cameras that can have problems and can be affected by fog and weather and other things, or just be, subjected to novel inputs, rather than seeing a stop sign with just a sensor that says there's a stop there. Well, that's much easier for machines to do. Of course, this requires a huge rethink in how we have our environments. We also have to make sure that no people are in those environments where they're going to do random things and act the way humans do. Or you're right, we would have to censor them individually and censor, like, well, are they on a bike? And everything would have to be censored. And then the question is,
so when you say censor, you don't mean like silence someone, but rather put a sensor on someone. Yeah,
put a sensor on somebody. Yeah,
for the class.
Well, in a way, we could also say that they could be barred from going places they used to go because that road's now for autonomous cars, and we can't have you weird random humans acting in this this non-machine way and this non-rational way, and so it's just too variable for us. So we need that just reserved for cars. So, but
and we really, already do this with with airports. Like you're not allowed to wander around on the tarmac, right?
Right, exactly. And so I think then we have to decide, and this is where we get into the dirty consequentialism. Just like, is it worth it? Is this envelope worth making for the product at hand? And I think with autonomous cars, it's a very clear no. I mean, it's worth it for trains. I mean, we've made envelopes for trains, and we don't allow people to walk on train tracks, and we bar people from crossing train tracks when there's a train going through. And there's an infrastructure that we've made for trains, and it serves a purpose of carrying goods, carrying many people to one area. Now, autonomous cars don't seem to serve that same purpose. I think those that are arguing for autonomous cars will say, well, it'll reduce traffic accidents by however many, fatalities or something like that. Of course, that's a hypothesis that has yet to be borne out. In order to test for that, we would have to have many autonomous cars driving on the road. So we would have to basically, a self-fulfilling prophecy, we'd have to just say, well, let's actually do it because we think it's going to work. And then we'd find out in the end, just like every computer system we've ever used, that, oh, well, there's a lot of side effects and problems. Like nobody anticipated Facebook was going to destroy democracy, but guess what? Surprise, it did. And so we'd have to have everybody switch over to autonomous cars. And then what would be the benefit to this? We'd have less fatalities. We'd still have the same old way. It seems like a pretty lame solution to the problem of getting people from point A to point B. And I think one of the most maybe boring solutions to this and more cost-effective solutions is to enhance our public transportation. And unfortunately, that's just not as exciting. And so what I'm saying with all of this, though, is that when we're talking about these envelopes, part of the reason I'm arguing for this knowledge that we should have about the boundaries and inputs is to say, well, what kind of envelope would we need in order for this to be successful, given what we know? And then when we think about that envelope, like with autonomous cars, and we think about how difficult it would be and how expensive it would be and how the rights infringements that you'd have to put on people, not to mention the side effects of somebody taking a bunch of sensors and sprinkling them on the road to mess with the cars. If they're in the bicycle helmets, well, just, take the sensor out and put it on the road. So that way we can see all the cars swerve around this thing just for fun. And we've already seen that with people drawing yellow lines around an autonomous car. I think it was some famous artist that did that. And then the car couldn't move because it can't cross the yellow line. It's like, well, these side effects as well. So we create this big envelope and then we find out their side effects. The envelope doesn't even work the way that we wanted. And we didn't really get any drastically new benefit that we didn't have before with people just driving their own cars. So it becomes this consequential analysis, like, is this envelope worth it? And that that's a question I think we have to ask, and we have to be talking about in order for us to proceed in a responsible way, integrating technology into society and our lives. And I think we've seen we've seen some of this play out. Google Sidewalk Labs in Toronto and in Portland, I think, both, to make this a big smart city with lots of cameras and sensors, and it was going to do all these wonderful things. Well, the people in those cities decided, no, this isn't worth it to us. We don't see enough benefit to make this envelope so that Google's technologies can work better. That's not a good enough benefit to us as a city. So I think I've seen that, and I'm really happy that those people made that, those cities made that calculation. They said, what is the cost of this, and what is the benefit that we're getting? And with autonomous cars, I think the cost would way outweigh the benefit. And with something like, cancerous mold detection, it seems like, well, it doesn't seem like that much of a cost, and it seems like a huge benefit. So yeah, let's create the envelope. Let's make sure that we're using this we're using this technology to help hospitals and help society.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things about that. So one is you brought up this problem of adversarial design.
Yeah.
Right. So if you can sort of assume that the only failure mode is accidental side effects, like someone accidentally buying a product via Amazon Echo, or accidentally sending a voicemail, and it's like they didn't mean to do it, nobody was trying to exploit the system, then that limits the sort of ways in which things can go wrong. But once you assume that there are some bad actors, people who are adversaries, then it gets much more complicated. So as you pointed out, like with self-driving cars, if there's plentiful access to the sensors that the cars are attuned to, the transmitters that they're attuned to, or the things like QR codes or whatever it might be that they're paying attention to, just yellow paint on the road, then they can be made to do things that they really oughtn't to do. And of course, you can then get into an arms race where it's like, well, then we figure out a countermeasure to this adversarial design, and then there's a countermeasure to the countermeasure, and you end up in this really ugly situation. But an alternative is to just have fewer of these technologies, or to put them in really controlled environments where people can't just walk in and throw a bunch of sensors down. And that strikes me as an interesting thing when it comes to self-driving cars in particular, because the way that the debate about self-driving cars has played out is really frustrating to me, because it always presumes that cars will remain privately owned, and that the owner will get to make choices about how their self-driving car operates. So like you could have like a, I respect other people's setting, which like sometimes lets the car like get damaged in order to not kill someone, or an I'm an asshole setting where the car will run other people over in order to avoid getting damaged itself. And people have actually written whole papers about this.
Oh yeah, I think colleagues of ours have written papers about this.
Yeah, former colleagues, unfortunately. This seems to me to be just madness. Like, why would you let the owner of this piece of metal decide whether other people get killed? Like, just make it part of public infrastructure. You'd need fewer of them anyway. And the envelopment would be a lot easier because you could standardize things. You wouldn't have like, oh, well, the Tesla ones are this way and the Volkswagen ones are that way, and the Ford ones are some other way, and they don't know how to talk to each other. You could just say like, look, in the downtown of this city, all we have are self-driving taxis. They're all the same. They all function in the same way. You can't bring a privately owned vehicle in here. So it's kind of like a train. It's just, rides on the road as opposed to on rails. You could even put it on rails if you wanted to.
Right.
Then you've enveloped it or enveloped it. I still don't know which one to say. And you've also changed the socioeconomic system in a way that makes it more efficient and probably more egalitarian.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about
Yeah,
that.
so absolutely. I think there, when we think about it in this way, when we start thinking about these envelopes, and if we decide that, you know, the envelope is just not worth it for autonomous cars. However, somebody could come back like you are right now and saying, well, there's certain circumstances when it would make sense. And I think, you know, there are plenty of, you know, maybe the downtown area is one where you're right, it could be on rails, or we could decide, well, there's certain streets and they're highly marked to say like, well, there's, and it's not going very fast. It's just to get people to point A, point B in this small environment that we've really made good, you know, we've really made an envelope for these cars, or for campuses, you know, like for delivering goods between buildings and campuses. And there might be these areas when it actually makes cost-effective sense.
Yeah, so like the port of Rotterdam has something like this.
Yeah,
but the only people working in the port are, you know, longshoremen who are trained and know, okay, this is an autonomous vehicle here, it's going to do certain things. You don't just let the random public members wander through the port.
Exactly. And so, and then it's just, well, then those contexts themselves can make this calculation to say, like, listen, this is our need, and this would be really helpful here. And you know what, it wouldn't be that bad to make this an enveloped environment for these vehicles. So yeah, let's go forward. But I think that you're right. The autonomous car debate is like, well, let's have all autonomous cars for everybody, or like, or you're basically stifling innovation. Or as Elon Musk said, if you're against autonomous cars, you're killing people. That's his famous quote about it, which is just absolutely absurd, while his cars are literally killing people. But I think to push back, you know, to push back and argue for a position that I'm completely against, one could say, like, people already have those settings on their, not in their cars, but in their minds. When you, or even worse, they don't have those settings and they're doing it randomly. So when they get into a dangerous situation with a car, they're swerving uncontrollably and running into the people rather than, and doing everything they can to try to save themselves. So in a way, one of the reasons that are put forward for autonomous vehicles is that right now we all have the asshole setting by default. We're all trying to save ourselves in these really quick situations. We are all trying to save ourselves. And so, you know, maybe it's, why is it any worse to have those settings in the car, or at least give the people the chance without the dangerous situation making them react immediately without any rational thought going on, and automatic reasoning, or whatever you want to call it. And instead, when they're, you know, in the comfort of a relaxed situation, say, no, I'd like to be a good person. I will make it so that it respects other people more, and, you know, we'd have more, maybe more lives. Now, there's a lot of problems with that, but I do think that I see the argument that people are trying to make. I don't want to give it no credit at all.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that then points to for me is, so you may be familiar with Amartya Sen's approach to ethics, where he talks about the importance not only of getting enough information, but not getting information that you shouldn't, and having sort of constraints that you're not allowed to use certain kinds of information when making moral decisions. This seems to be quite relevant in the autonomous car debate, because if you look, for instance, at this famous moral machines paper that Azim Sharif and a few others published out of MIT a few years ago, they essentially asked people, like, okay, suppose the car can run over 2 pregnant women or 4 homeless people. Suppose the car could run over, you know, kill the passenger, like the driver/passenger, or run over 2 children. Suppose the car could crash into 3 women or 4 men, like all these kinds of things, which, first of all, unless the sensors get a lot better, that's never going to be a choice that the car could actually make. But supposing that it could, like, why would you let it use those inputs in the first place? Like, it seems like there are certain inputs. I guess the assumption is always like more inputs, more information is always better. But there are certain things that, because of histories of of discrimination, histories of bias, prejudice, you would actually want it to be impossible to use. And it seems to me like a lot of the research in this area is just assuming like, well, let's ask ordinary people and then embody their biases in the AI so that it runs over the old guy instead of the younger person because people are ageist, or it runs over the man rather than the woman because while people are sexist usually in ways that harm women, they seem to prefer that the cars run over men. Like, it seems to be like,
I mean, this
crazy.
paper was, this paper was, I mean, in my opinion, awful, because I think it misled the public to thinking it was a paper about autonomous cars. And it had nothing, and I think the key thing to take away from this is that it had nothing to do with autonomous cars. It was an interesting way to find out what biases people had. That was all it was. And so we could compare biases based on location and age group. And like, if you were, if you were younger, you might, favor, I don't know, saving the homeless more than the older generation. But all it was is explaining who we're biased against. And the vehicle to do that was an autonomous car, swerving or not. But it was just a thought experiment. I don't understand how it connects to how we should develop autonomous cars at all. Like, I never got that point. It was a huge leap for me. And so it really, and then you're right. I think then they take that to mean, well, this is what people would rather do. So this is how we should make technologies. Well, guess what? We've already run, we talk about reinventing the wheel. We've already talked about different scenarios where we have problems of people hiring men for management positions. Historically, men were just always managers, and they always got were hired for these positions way more than women were. And so we could run the same thought experiment, and then we could say, well, we should make these AI hiring algorithms so that men are favored more than women, because that's what people seem to agree with. It's like, no, obviously we shouldn't do that.
That's literally
what happened.
Already happened.
Yeah, with Amazon. Exactly. So it's funny to me that with the autonomous car debate, it's like these people just didn't understand the basics of what they were doing. And it got so much attention. Was it in Nature that they published this? I was just horrified, because it seemed like just such a minimal understanding of some basic points could have helped them not do what they were doing.
Yeah, no, I actually tried to talk Azim out of it, because he was my colleague in Oregon at the time, and he just couldn't resist the
of course not.
It's publishing in a top journal.
Absolutely, and it's been cited probably 1,000 times by now. Like, there's a lot of motivation to do that. But we are if we needed something to tell me that humans are biased and that different cultures are biased against different things, I didn't need that. I think we already have tons of empirical evidence on that. So I think that paper was only useful in understanding the problems with the way technologists and AI researchers are thinking about how are they designing their machines, and thinking about the ethics of their machines, because they don't have this understanding, which is why there is a drastic need for philosophers and ethicists to tackle these problems and to help the policymakers do something about it. Because you can't have, we're having boards of advisors that are filled with technology company executives telling them what to do. And of course even if they have their motivation in the right place, and sometimes I genuinely believe that they want to do good for society, but they don't have a basic understanding of ethics. So they're just misguided at best.
Yeah. So the hiring algorithm is a nice example of that, because there was an audit of one of these recently that found that the two strongest weights that were put on these factors. So it's basically like, take your CV, your resume, upload it to a website, and it'll get automatically evaluated by a natural language processing algorithm. And it'll then say, okay, this one's management material, this one's, menial worker, whatever it might be. The two strongest factors were being named Jared and having lacrosse in high school.
That's like, I like that kind of work that shows that that's what was going on, because in a way, I mean, if we are just tackling this problem head on and just saying, okay, we want an algorithm to evaluate resumes, and then we get into this huge regressive problem, because then we're like, well, what's a good resume? Like, how are we going to train this algorithm to say what a good resume is and what a bad resume is? And so I'm imagining what they did is they took top level executives' resumes from when they were starting out, I guess. I mean, they can't take the current resume. So they had to do a very specific choice of what things they were taking. So you're already deciding who, you're already making a big ethical choice, right? That who is good in management now, or who's in management now, is a rubric for how we want to evaluate future employees, which is already, I mean, it should just be commonsensical that that's not right. Not only are companies wildly mismanaged now, but it leaves no room for human creativity and a novel form of what could be good, of seeing talent where it didn't exist before. I mean, we don't only hear music that sounds like it comes from the 1920s anymore. Guess what? It's evolved. Good music has changed. Good employees and good managers will also evolve as context change around us. Being a good manager in a pandemic may not have the same skill set as being a good manager without a pandemic. So we need to constantly be updating that, which, to bring it back to algorithms and AI, makes it an especially bad problem for artificial intelligence to tackle. If the notion of what is good or what we're trying to capture is a moving target, that's not good for AI. AI is not good at detecting that. AI is good at detecting a fixed target. And that goes back to not necessarily right and envelopment, but it goes back to choosing, like the basic choice of which problems we're going to tackle with the tool at hand. And we should know properties about the tool at hand to make sure that they are a good fit.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to the importance of knowing what the training data is and knowing what the inputs are, because so that's one of the things that your paper points out, is that
absolutely,
if you know that the training data is resumes from dudes who are now in their 70s who got hired 40 years ago because they knew a guy who knew a guy, then maybe that's not the best thing to use to predict who will be a good manager next year. And that relates to the Stanford paper about cancer detection as well, right? So that paper is, I mean, it's amazing. So they trained this convolutional neural network to say of a picture of a skin lesion, whether it was cancerous or not, and then if it was cancerous, which type of cancer it might be. And it got up to almost the level of human experts, if I recall correctly. So that's incredible. And it was trained on a data set of something like, if I remember correctly, 16,000 images.
A ton of images, yeah.
So fantastic, sounds great. My colleague, Oshin Deary, I don't know if you've seen his paper with Catherine Bailey, but you mentioned another paper that points to a similar problem. They actually looked at every single image in this data set to try to figure out how many of them were white skin as opposed to skin of people of color.
Wow.
Have you seen this?
I haven't seen that paper, no.
You want to take a guess, out of like 16,000 images, how many were not white skin?
85.
Two.
Two. Oh, geez. That's a disaster. Yeah.
Right. So if this thing gets unleashed in a population that's not white skinned, it's just going to be making decisions at random, essentially.
Yeah, and exactly. And so that doesn't make this algorithm terrible. In fact, I mean, it's something that I'm concerned about with all this work on bias in AI, is that this could cause people to just say, well, we need 16,000 images of white skin and 16,000 images of black skin. But that may not necessarily be the best way to go about it. And this gets really scary and dangerous, the language that I use to describe this. But the issue could be is that they may be two different problems instead of one problem. Detecting cancer on dark skin may be a different problem than detecting cancer on light skin. And I worry because, I mean, especially growing up in the United States, talking about separate but equal sounds very like terrible language, but the idea that there may need to be two different algorithms depending, two different tools basically to detect, you know, for cancer for each skin type. And that might be better than trying to make one data set completely representative of everyone, because guess what? I mean, colored skin isn't the same all around. I mean, we don't just have black and white, we have all different kinds of shades. And maybe there's, you know, another problem with a group of people that we hadn't, you know, we didn't think, we thought it would just be somewhere in the middle and we grouped them in with darker skin, but maybe it's not really the case. And so we have to, you know, we do have to do a lot of testing on that, but we may need different tools for different groups of people, depending on the problem, right? Sometimes that might be really unethical, but in this case, it seems justified because the color of your skin may really change the way that you identify cancer.
Yeah, and especially with like skin cancer, which is being detected via images.
Yeah, exactly. It seems so clear. That's
if you were
a relevant
with,
consideration.
Cancer of the liver, it would be different.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it seems like, well, I mean, if you're concerned about unequal treatment, having an algorithm that works for one subpopulation and doesn't work for another one is also another kind of inequality, right? So what you want is equality when it comes to the accuracy of the algorithm, not necessarily equality when it comes to like the underlying data set or something like that.
Yeah, and I just, because this, you know, I think just historically having separate things for different groups of people just sounds really bad, and so we just have to be very careful. But you're absolutely right. And already, I mean, there's some great work on you know, sexism in medical care and problems where everybody treats women. They treat women as if they were men almost, and they miss lots of things that they should be seeing. And the tools they use are often developed for male bodies, and so that they don't work as well for female bodies. Well, we should probably have different tools depending on what kind of body you have. I mean, we wouldn't use the same tools for children that we use for adults just based on equality. And we need to start thinking of AI as a tool. So that way we can say, well, we need to fit the tool for the, you know, the problem at hand. And if there's a different problem for different groups of people, then we need different tools, different AI tools, if AI is indeed the tool that we want to use at all. But if it is, we may need different tools to do it. And I think the problem sometimes is that AI gets talked about as like one giant thing. AI, we just sprinkle some AI on it. But the fact is it's a methodology for doing something. It's not a thing in and of itself. And it gets used as a noun far too often. And not necessarily a noun, but anyway.
Yeah. So one thing that occurred to me several times as I was reading through the paper was you may be familiar with Meg Mitchell's paper on model cards. But the basic idea with a model card is, you know, it costs a lot to train a machine learning model, and so you only want to do so when there's some advantage to it, when there's some benefit to it. But then you end up with this thing that you just release into the wild, and people may end up deploying it in situations where it's not suitable, where the envelope doesn't exist. And she argues in that paper that models should come with like almost like a nutritional label that just says like, hey, here are the things that this was trained on, here are the populations that it should be used with, here are, you know, some things to watch out for where it might easily go astray, and so on and so forth. And it seemed to me that your paper was really simpatico with that idea of model cards. It's a little bit different because for her, it's like, we just make the models and distribute them and let people decide whether it's appropriate to use them. And you take a more sort of top-down regulatory approach where it's like, show me the model card before you're allowed to release it in the first place. And then I'm gonna fine or imprison anyone who uses it in a different way. Maybe that's a slightly stronger way of putting it, but maybe not. Maybe that's actually what you think. So I'm sort of curious, like where you think the sweet spot is. Should it be like, let the individual user consult the model card in the same way that like I can look at the calorie count and decide whether to eat something, and no one's going to come in and like arrest me for eating fatty food or something? Or should it be more like, the airline industry where there's just really strong regulations, and if you violate them, you get in serious trouble really quickly?
Yeah, and so I hate to use this answer, but first I'll talk about the industry that I'm most interested in my work, which is generally the public sphere. So because I think AI is most interesting in those spheres, although it gives us some convenience and recommends us the next Netflix movie and turns on and off our lights. I don't find that very interesting. But I do find the government's use of AI to be exceptionally interesting when they're using it for, they're going to use it for public transportation. They're going to use it to make better decisions and collect information, and for security and for all these things. And for that, I want a top-down regulatory approach to say public agencies are allowed to use this or they're not. And if they are allowed to use this, they're allowed to use it only under very specific constraints, because we care about liberal democracy and we want to make sure that that is preserved. So I think that's the first step, because also that's where most of the interesting things are going on. It's in hospitals, and it's in education, it's in transportation. These are public sectors. Now, the rest of the AI stuff, I agree. I feel a little bit weird saying like we're going to arrest people that use this in a weird way. Although I want to say I want to restrict a lot of the use that's going on out there, because something like facial recognition, which has been argued to be similar to plutonium and how dangerous it is and it's being used. I had a friend of mine send me, who obviously doesn't know me that well, send me a little video clip made by some like deep fake AI of my son. They used a picture of my son to make this. And I was like, okay, that's, appalling for a number of privacy reasons, but I also just thought it was weird that all of a sudden anybody can just do this. It seems like a tool that shouldn't be allowed to be used yet. It seems too dangerous. And for the benefit of a funny video clip, doesn't seem to be enough for me. But I also think a lot of things
in case anyone who's watching is not familiar, can you say what a deep fake is?
Right. A deep fake is able to take like video clips or images as input into a machine learning or a neural network modeling system, and then able to create novel movement. So make your face and maybe even your body do and say things that were dictated by somebody else. So if you have a chance to look at the latest deepfakes of Tom Cruise, you just have to look up Tom Cruise deepfake, and it is horrifyingly realistic. And the idea that now anybody's face can be used for that, there's now a lot of problems in celebrities that have their faces used for deepfake porn, which is a huge thing going on right now. People want to see certain women perform acts that they probably wouldn't do themselves. And now with the technology, this is pretty easily accomplished. And it seems like a technology that doesn't really serve much benefit. So in some ways, I do want a much more top-down regulatory approach, especially when it doesn't seem to provide any benefit and it causes such harm to others. Now, having an Alexa in your home, it seems, I don't want people to have Alexas in their home. It seems weird to say that people aren't allowed to have them in their home. It does seem that it's within the confines of your own home, although I wish that people had to notify others.
Is it really confined though?
Well, if the sensors are confined, then at least I don't have to be worried about being picked up on the sensor. And then the only thing that I would like to have is the choice on whether to enter a home or not with those sensors in there. And I would like it to be a norm, not a law, but a norm that people say, by the way, I have an Amazon Alexa always on. And so are you comfortable with that? I think that should be something that is notified. I would tell people that I have a massive German Shepherd at my house before they came in to make sure, do you feel comfortable? Although my dog's really nice, it's really big. If you're really afraid of dogs, maybe you don't want to be inside. I think that's a nice thing and a proper etiquette for me to do.
So if you had like a surveillance camera, in your bathroom, you should probably tell people before they go in.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
you should probably
yeah.
not have a surveillance camera in your
You should
bathroom, but
probably
if
not.
you so choose, especially an internet connected one, and I mean,
Oh
there's
man.
recent problems with these. I can't understand the logic that goes on to think like, well, in case that 1 in a million thing happens where somebody's going to steal my golden toilet, I need to have an internet connected camera that notifies me that somebody's in my bathroom. I mean, it seems like the cost benefit is just so far askew there that I can't myself understand it, but I also don't have a smartphone. So maybe I'm just like out there on an island by myself.
I don't know, man. I think you're onto something here. So maybe we can conclude just by talking a little bit about the so-called Internet of Things, which I'm sure you hate as well. So for those who are not familiar, the Internet of Things is this phrase that's used for referring to essentially putting sensors on all kinds of stuff. And the sensors can be audio sensors, they can be cameras, they can be haptic, they can be more or less anything, any kind of sensor that you want, and then connecting that sensor to either a local network or in most cases, the internet. And you may be familiar with this paper that came out almost exactly a year ago of the IoT Internet of Things device that was supposed to be able to do something like facial recognition, except with the human anus. And you were supposed to be able to put it in your toilet to figure out who was peeing and pooping where.
I did. I did read that.
And it was
I thought it was a joke, but
connected.
it wasn't a joke.
It was not a joke. No, it was
not a
published
joke.
in a real journal. And the proposal was to actually install these things and connect them literally to the World Wide Web. So this seems like a case where we know quite clearly what the inputs are. There's no training data really, except lots of pictures of people's butts. And the output is not just something that, I mean, maybe if you kept it within your own home and you had a relative who suffered from some gastric disorder like irritable bowel syndrome and you're trying to take care of them, I could see like a case where you just might find it reasonable to install something like this. But to just connect it to the World Wide Web and these things, the Internet of Things devices are the most hackable stuff that's out there, seems to me absolutely insane. And yet this is being proposed by serious researchers at serious universities, or at least allegedly serious researchers at allegedly serious universities, and actually being manufactured and rolled out to the public. Do you think that there's any way to get a handle on Internet of Things in particular, given that it's all sensor-based or almost all sensor-based, and given that people seem to want to have not just local networks, but connect directly to the World Wide Web with these things?
Well, the way I see getting out of it is to not have the Internet of Things. I mean, I understand some of the convenience, right? I mean, there was that stupid thing where you had a washing machine that you could push a button and order more detergent, and it was connected to internet and Amazon. I can, okay, that's really dumb to me, but still, I get it, you know, like you're by the washing machine when you're there and, oh, I'm out, so I just order this next one. And there seems to be this proliferation of with the Internet of Things, of like this convenience that it establishes. Now, on the other flip side of that, it's also exceptionally inconvenient, as we were just talking before this, and the thunderstorm rolled through and the internet wasn't exactly perfectly connected. It seems weird that I can't use my washing machine or my coffee machine because the internet went down. I should be able to make coffee either way. And there was that hilarious story of the guy spending 10 hours trying to make a cup of coffee, but it had to be connected to the internet in order for him to use it. And it wasn't connecting very well. And then his internet was down. It was just like, oh my gosh, 10-hour cup of coffee, and I'll make you 20, I'll make you 30 cups of coffee in that time with just an old fashioned machine. And what benefit are you really getting from that? Especially when you have an internet connected device. I mean, I don't, but most people do, in their pocket. I mean, it's already pretty convenient to order something, you know? So we do have to change because I think they're going to be manufactured as long as people are going to buy them. like crazy. And I think we have to start, and maybe something bad has to happen where like people really feel the negativity of having, or where they start hearing stories about other people suffering from having an internet connected device that shouldn't be connected to the internet. Whether that's your doorbell or a lock or these cameras. I mean, cameras should be obviously bad. If anybody wants to be really afraid, well, watch Mr. Robot, but then also go to Shodan.io, which is featured in the show. And this is like a Google-like search engine where you can search for internet-connected cameras. And scarily, you can then just do another Google search for default username and passwords, which it's something like 70% of people haven't changed. And you can just start trying the default. Now, this is illegal, so don't do it. But you can, in principle, go and do that. You can search for all the internet-connected devices on your street. You can see their model number, and then you can go check for default username and password. You can get the IP address and just go log in, and then you can have live video. There's all kinds of cases of this happening. And that really starts to make you question, should I have this device on the internet? Because it's not just cameras, that's just the most obvious, but your doorbell, you know, somebody could just go in and find the IP address and start hacking away, and then like making a doorbell go uncontrollably just as a prank. And guess what? Kids are a lot smarter than us at programming. You guys are probably a lot smarter than me and Mark programming, right? And so people are gonna have fun with this, and you open yourself up to these lines of attacks, not from just people on your street, but from anywhere in the world, because it's connected to the internet. And that just seems like a huge risk factor for such tiny, tiny, tiny convenience. And so I also think though, I mean, aside from personal choices, which I really, I want my future work to work on personal choices as a human being, like why are you integrating that technology in your life? And like, have you thought about this? You should make better choices about this. I want my kids to think more about this, not to not have any technology, but to really think about why it is you're integrating that in, what benefit it's giving you, and what kind of risks it opens you up to. But with the Internet of Things, there's some clear things that we should do right away. I mean, we should have security standards that, for instance, a very simple one is forcing people to change the default username and passwords of these things out of the box in order for them to use it. That's a simple solution, and it has not been regulated, which seems, I don't know, I just don't understand why. That's just such an easy thing to do, and we would make things better. And unfortunately, I just don't think we can legislate against people making internet-connected toasters. I don't see a way of drawing the line to just say, well, I mean, I would just have a stupid clause. If it's stupid, don't do it. But obviously, that's not going to be like have much force in the legal realm. So I don't see how we can just legislate against doing it. And so we're going to have to beef up the standards, and we're going to have to like beef up the critical thinking of the populace to say like, well, let's just not make a market for those things. Like, you shouldn't buy your kids an internet connected Barbie. I mean, they do exist, but you probably shouldn't do it. Yeah, I forget the name of it.
What does it even do?
I can't remember. My wife used to use this as an example for one of her privacy talks. And it was just, you know, it's like all of a sudden you have, and there's some great videos of hackers who hacked in to some of these devices and then were talking to children. And it's like, oh man, that's really, really scary. And that's the risk that you opened it up all so that you could, I don't know what you could do. I mean, these are the kinds of lack of critical thinking that we're asking ourselves when we're buying technologies.
Yeah. So I guess one last thing to maybe chat about for a couple of minutes is like, so Meg Mitchell's stuff on model cards, and also your paper emphasizing the importance of, you know, inputs and outputs and training data and functions, all sort of assumes that there's no way that what we think are the inputs and outputs remain the only inputs and outputs. Right. So, you know, you could imagine like a doomsday scenario where somehow the Internet of Things Barbie ends up ordering drone strikes. Right. That shouldn't happen. But it's not inconceivable. I mean, there was a case in Las Vegas a few years ago where an Internet of Things connected aquarium, which was, you know, meant to like regulate temperature and oxygenation of the water and light and things like that, was used to hack into the accounting system, and the hackers stole millions of dollars from the casino. via its aquarium. And no one ever showed up in person. They just did it electronically. It seems to me like one of the serious sort of threat vectors here is that even if we get ourselves in a position where we know how these things are supposed to work, that only covers use by people who use them as they're meant to be used. And of course, there are bad actors out there.
Yeah, I think this gets to a really important point, and I think I kind of mentioned this in my paper, where I talk about at the end, I think I talk about how, what is the system that we're dealing with? Like, is it just an individual sensor, AI equipped sensor, or is it the car itself? And I come down on the side that it's the car that itself, but this creates an interesting problem with the IoT, the Internet of Things, because, well, if everything's connected to the internet and it's all one big system, because that's the aquarium problem, right? The aquarium had its own system, but it was connected to the larger system. And so then it's like, well, this larger system is capable of much more. And now it's so complex that I can't even understand what the possible outputs could be. Transferring, buying a bunch of Bitcoin and transferring it to somebody else's wallet. I didn't know that was possible, but guess what? You've made a system so complex. And so when you're connecting all your devices up in your house, your lights and your TV and all of that other stuff, you're creating an exceptionally complex overarching system that now can, they can use one internet connected light to get into your internet connected security system. And it's like, oh, I was only worried about lights with the light, but I should have also been worried about the larger system. And that's where I think it gets, the Internet of Things is really scary. When you have people talk about internet connected, autonomous vehicles, and you're just like, well, now you're opening it up to a much larger system and a much more larger. Now we're not just worried about it not seeing a stop sign and running into another car. We're worried about a hacker taking it over and controlling it, as has been demonstrated by researchers in the past. And it's like, well, maybe it shouldn't be connected to the internet, but then they're saying, well, if you don't connect it to the internet, then you can't, talk to other cars and all this other stuff. But again, we're creating a very complex system, and we're only thinking about the risk scenarios that we can possibly imagine. And just like we couldn't have imagined Facebook being used to undermine a US election, but just, I don't know, Facebook is just a way to connect to friends. Like we couldn't have imagined that. We can't imagine the threats that we're going to have in the future, or just the natural side effects that will happen. And this wild west of big technology, just innovating and innovating and innovating, I think we've shown that it hasn't borne the fruits that it was supposed to have, and the threats have been disastrous. So I think going forward, now where AI is a completely novel thing, we should probably slow it down quite a bit. And I think that's what my paper, and probably Meg Mitchell's paper as well, it's like, well, if I force you to do all of this stuff and give me all this information, you are going to be much slower, and you're going to give some people information to be like, wait, I'm not using that. That's a bad idea. That just sounds like a bad idea. And it's terrible. Before we had information about what trans fats were and what foods they were in, we didn't have the information, and we needed to say, well, I'm not going to eat that. Trans fats are really poisonous to the body. And now we forced people to at first know that they were there, and then second for governments to regulate that they can't be used. But we needed that information to know there was even a problem. And I think with AI, before companies start using AI to hire people, we should probably have the information to at least say, like, well, give people the evidence they need to say, well, there might be future problems here, and we should check that out before we use it in the wild and cause real people real harm. Real people didn't get jobs at Amazon because they were women. That's real harm that this algorithm did, just because we could have just had a model card and prevented that. That seems really terrible that we don't have such a simple thing that the designers already knew. It's not like I'm forcing them to do weeks of extra work. Nope, just providing basic information with their equipment, just like we get basic information with almost every machine we buy about certain things, about its electricity usage and other things. We have that information. We should have the information that's novel to AI as well, so that we don't have to have this big bad scenario where we're doing tons of horrible things, and then we have to go back in time and say, well, no, you should have been doing it this way the whole time. We already know this is a problem with every technology that's ever come out, so let's do it right this time. And I say this knowing full well we're going to do it wrong again. And it keeps me having a job, though, to talk about how bad it all is all going.
Well, speaking of jobs, so Meg Mitchell was employed by Google, and a couple of weeks ago was fired uh, for advocating for precisely the things we're just talking about. So
Yes.
to end on an uplifting note, probably we can't trust industry to self-regulate in this case.
No, we can't, and we never have been. I don't know why when we trusted industry to dispose of their toxic chemicals properly, they did it in our rivers. I mean, the industry is going to do the cheapest, easiest option that makes them the most money. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. I'm not against capitalism per se, but we don't have capital. We've never had capitalism that's, without rules and rules to protect society. And I don't know why big technology or policymakers are listening to this idea that they have good intentions and they're going to do it right. Even if they do have good intentions, which, let's face it, they're not going to do something that really undermines their bottom line. And even if they did, though, have great intentions, they're likely to get it wrong. Guess what? They're not experts in that area. They're experts at designing technologies, not experts in doing what's great for society and developing going towards an ideal liberal democratic system. So either way you want to have it, it's not a good idea for them to be in charge of regulating themselves. That's a nonsensical idea.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. I really appreciate it. I'm going to close the recording now.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.